Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, we're talking about some great albums celebrating a 50th anniversary in 2025. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So when I look back at albums from the 70s, every single year there's such great iconic albums released. I actually think 75 was a little bit of a down year, because I think mainly because it's sandwiched between two great years in 74 and 76. And that's not to say there weren't really big iconic albums released in 75. I just think compared to other years of that decade, I don't think it quite stacks up to some of the other ones. But some of my favorite albums of all time came out back in 1975. The first one is one that it took me a little while, I think, to really fully embrace this album. It came out back on February 24th, 1975, and that is Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin. I started listening to Led Zeppelin, it was probably 93, so I was probably like 13 or 14 years old. I love the song Kashmir, and that's like the one song I would listen to off this album all the time. But it was probably, I'd say, like the early to mid part of the 2000s when I really started digging into a lot of the other tracks on this album. I really understood why this album is held in such high regard. And I would still rank Led Zeppelin 2 and Led Zeppelin 4 as better albums, but I put Physical Graffiti just behind them. It is, I think, one of the best albums of the early to mid part of the 70s. A couple of days later, on February 28th, another one of my favorite albums was released, and that is Welcome to My Nightmare by Alice Cooper. This is a very pivotal time in Alice's career because this was the first of his solo albums. The Alice Cooper band had broken up. Alice decided to keep the whole thing going. He changed his name to Alice Cooper. And as far as like his solo albums go, I think this is the pinnacle of his solo career. Would I rank this as high compared to the albums that came out before it? Maybe not. I think School's Out, Killer, Billion Dollar Babies, I think those are all better albums overall. But Alice's solo career was different because Alice's solo career was more about, I think, the theatrics of the music. Sometimes it felt like the music was almost like a byproduct of the theatrics that Alice had. But I think, like, as far as like overall music goes, the music on Welcome to My Nightmare, I think, is a little more closely aligned to what he was doing with the band compared to what he would do kind of moving forward. And over the last year or so, Alice has been releasing those, it's like a deluxe edition of his albums. I know he did School's Out, he did Killer, there's one for Billion Dollar Babies, there's one for Muscle of Love also. I'd love to see them do the same thing with this album because there's some great live material that I think they could really put together in a package with this album. I know there's some demos and stuff also that they could include to really make a package to really honor the greatness of this album. The next album, I guess, is kind of the opposite of Physical Graffiti, where I loved this entire album when I was younger, but then I went a really long time without listening to it and kind of forgot how great this album really is. Released back on April 8th, that is Toys in the Attic by Aerosmith. So I got into Aerosmith when Pump was released. What was that, 1990 or 1991 when that album came out? And then from there, I kind of went back and started listening to, I think it was Permanent Vacation was the next album I got into. And then it was Toys in the Attic. And from Toys in the Attic is when I really kind of expanded into their 70s albums. And it was really this album, from beginning to end. This is the first album of theirs where I was really kind of locked into it. I love every single song on this album. And then I went probably a good 15 years without listening to this album. I really got into, I guess in the middle part of the 90s, I got into grunge, I got into punk. I started getting away from that more like a classic rock sound. And it was probably within the last, I'd say, 10 years where I started listening to this album again. And like immediately I was like, wow, this is such a great album. I knew it was good. I always ranked it really high in Aerosmith's catalog, but I'd forgotten how great the album was overall. And yes, this has some of the most iconic tracks on here. Walk This Way, Sweet Emotion, Toys in the Attic, we're all huge tracks. But I think what really makes this album so great are all the other lesser known tracks on it. The next album is one where I know it was a big album when it came out. It was the band's big breakthrough commercial hit. But I think over the last 50 years, it's kind of been lost to time. It kind of gets lost in some of the band's other big albums. Came out back on June 10th, and that is One of These Nights by the Eagles. I know One of These Nights, Lion Eyes were two of the big tracks, and Take It to the Limit is probably one of their best known tracks of all time. But when you talk about the Eagles, I think this is an album that, kind of gets lost. Like I said, you're going to talk about Hotel California. I think this is the one big album that kind of overshadows the rest of their career. I feel like On the Border and Desperado even get talked about more in this album, but this album was like the end of the period, or the beginning period of the band. It was the last album with the full lineup. Of course, they would go on and do Hotel California after, which would be one of the biggest selling albums of all time. But kind of going back and listening to this album, it's another one where, I would put this up there with all the other great albums the band did. So on July 11th, 1975, Fleetwood Mac would release their self-titled album. And this was like the big comeback album for the band. So when the band released Heroes Are Hard to Find, which was 74, I think, when that album came out, Bob Welch would leave the band afterwards. There was a lot of inner turmoil. There was lawsuits within the band. The band actually, I think, broke up temporarily before they recorded that album. And then after Bob Welch left, and they brought in Stevie Nicks, they brought in Lindsey Buckingham, I don't think anyone really knew the direction that the band would go, and they would go on to record. I know Rumors is held up there as one of the best albums of all time. Me personally, I prefer this album over Rumors. I think maybe some of the hype behind Rumors has a little bit to play into it, but this is an album that, I started listening to this, it was probably 93, 94, so I guess it's probably around the same time that I started listening to Led Zeppelin. But when I started listening to Fleetwood Mac, it was this album. Then I went on to Rumors, and maybe that's why also I lean a little bit towards their self-titled album. But it's just a masterpiece, and it's one that I think definitely should be held up there as one of the best albums that the band ever did, up there with Rumors. Another album I think has kind of flown under the radar over the last, 50 years. I think mainly because of how big some of the band's other albums were. I know this was a big album when it was released, but I think it's kind of been lost to time since then. It came out back on July 28th, and that is Sabotage by Black Sabbath. This is a different kind of Sabbath album. It's heavier, it's darker. I know the band was going through some legal battles at the time. They were being sued by their former manager. I think Ozzy, or maybe it's Tony Iommi, said in an interview that this is the only album that they ever recorded where they had lawyers in the studio with them. I think a lot of that kind of came through in the music on this album. It doesn't have any other huge tracks on here, but beginning and end, there's not a bad track on this album. And it's one where, I think a lot of the tracks on here, I think, are better than some of the lesser known tracks on, say, Paranoid or Volume 4, especially Hole in the Sky, Symptom of the Universe. Those two tracks, those are probably two of my top 15 Black Sabbath tracks ever. So in 1984, Bruce Springsteen would release Born in the USA. It is probably the following year. I think the following summer of 1985. I was 6 years old. That was when I really kind of fell in love with that album. But it really wasn't until I listened to Born to Run, which was released on August 25th, 1975, that I really fell in love with Bruce Springsteen's 70s music. And after his first couple of albums weren't huge commercial successes, he tried to do something a little different on this album. Tried to be a little more experimental. There's some R&B influences on here. There's some folk rock on here. This was really an effort to be a little more mainstream musically than what he'd done earlier in his career. And it paid off. Because then he'd go on to do Darkness at the Edge of Town. He'd do The River in 1980, Nebraska, all that before he would get to Born in the USA. I think even though Born in the USA is, I think, his most recognizable album, this is easily the best album he ever did. Another album that I expect to have a huge anniversary release this year, released on September 12th, and that is Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd. And the reason why I expect us to have a big anniversary release is because Pink Floyd never misses an opportunity to do something big and to kind of get more money out of their fans. Even though this album's been pressed to death over the years, there is some material that isn't available on vinyl, though. They released the Immersion box set, I guess it was quite a few years ago now they did that. But there were some extra bonus material that was included in that CD box set that's not available on vinyl. So there is some stuff that they could put together to do a really nice package. We'll see what the band does, though. And it was always going to be difficult to follow up an album like The Dark Side of the Moon. And I feel like a lot of bands would just try to copy what they did on the album before. And that's not what Pink Floyd did on this. They tried to take, I guess the best way to kind of put this album is, This album is a tribute to Syd Barrett. The album is bookended by Shine On You Crazy Diamond, which of course is a song about Syd Barrett. The title track is about Syd also, but the distinction that this album has is this is the only album from the band that has the only song from the band that's not sung by one of the band members. But from what I've read, when they were recording the song Have a Cigar, David Gilmour tried to sing the vocals on there. It just didn't sound right. Roger Waters tried to sing it also, same thing. And they even actually tried to sing it as a duet. Just whatever they did, the vocals just did not sound right on it. But Roy Harper happened to be in the recording studio next door. They had him come over. He sang vocals on it, and the song just clicked. But putting a box set together for this album, I think would be even better than what they did for The Dark Side of the Moon, because there's some great live material from around this time. There definitely is some unreleased material, some stuff that was only released in the Immersion box set. But, when it comes to Pink Floyd, you're either going to get a whole bunch of stuff or you're going to get absolutely nothing. We might get a box set, like what they did with the Dark Side of the Moon. Then they released a standard version of it. Then they released a UV colored version of it, which I would love to see them do for this album also. But, like I said, they're either going to do a whole bunch of stuff or they're going to do probably nothing. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think of this. What are some great albums released in 1975? They're celebrating the 50th anniversary this year. Because like I said earlier, I think it was kind of a down year when it comes to 70s music. I think really kind of comparing it to 74 and 76, I think those were both better years than the 1975. But there were some great albums released. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure to give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.